A guy who said he's the boss chef of a fancy steakhouse came to our house demanding $3,000 for the bill my daughter supposedly ran up there. It was impossible because she didn't even go there. I stood firm against them, even though they looked really serious. I'm Leila, 30 years old, living with my husband Daniel and our daughter Emma. I got tricked by an ex who took $3,000 from me. And then I found out I was pregnant with his baby. I tried to contact him, but he disappeared. After my divorce, I was pretty much broke, but I still had my daughter Emma. I was preparing myself for tough times when I got the news that my ex-boyfriend got arrested. Daniel, who's now my husband, showed up to ask me about it. He supported me through all the stress with my ex. Even though I thought our age gap might be a problem, I found myself drawn to Daniel because he was strong and dependable. Surprisingly, he accepted me despite my past. Now, we have a great relationship with Daniel's parents and we're living happily. One day, Daniel's parents called, saying they missed us and wanted to see their grandchild. They treat Emma like their own, and it makes me really happy. Sure, I'll tell Daniel about it. My mother-in-law happily said thanks and hung up. It takes about 5 hours to get to my in-laws' place from the city where we live. It's a quiet countryside spot where time moves slowly. When Daniel got home in the evening, I quickly told him about his parents' message. He suggested we take some time off to visit them since he hadn't taken any vacation this month. He checked with his boss, who thankfully approved our time off. We were excited to see his parents after so long. But on the day we planned to go, Daniel suddenly had to work. He told us to go ahead without him and that he'd join us later, possibly not until the next morning. I informed my in-laws about the change and set off with our daughter. When we got to my in-laws' place, they welcomed us warmly and we had a nice time there. They were excited for Daniel to arrive soon. The next morning, my in-laws went to the barn like they usually do. I offered to help, but they insisted I relax during my visit. While waiting for them to come back, the doorbell rang. It was too early for Daniel to be there, so I assumed it was a neighbor. I quickly opened the door and found a man in his 70s staring at me angrily. He claimed to be the owner of a local steakhouse and said my daughter had left without paying a $3,000 bill. I was shocked and tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He said a girl had eaten and drunk a lot without paying, and since she was my daughter, I had to pay. I asked for his name, Ethan, and said I needed to check with my in-laws. He was impatient, but agreed to wait. I asked the man to wait while I quickly called my in-laws to confirm something. They answered promptly and shared a surprising fact with me. Trying to keep my composure, I glanced at the man in front of me. "I'm sorry, but I can't pay you," I said firmly. He was outraged, insisting that if I didn't pay, it would hurt his business and he'd call the police. I tried to explain there might be a misunderstanding, but he was adamant. Just as he was about to call the police, a passing officer caught his attention. The owner explained the situation, and the officer turned to me with a serious look, asking to speak with me. Feeling intimidated, I didn't know what to do. "Your daughter is suspected of dining and dashing," the officer said sternly. He demanded I hand her over immediately. Panicked, I insisted there had to be a mistake. My daughter wouldn't do something like that. But the officer wouldn't budge. Seeing the tension, the steakhouse owner offered a compromise, saying he wasn't heartless. "Since we're neighbors, I'll forgive her if you can pay," Ethan said, surprising us all. When asked if he was sure, he chuckled, saying it didn't bother him. "She's just a young girl. I knew she couldn't pay from the start, but she still wanted to enjoy my food. Isn't that something to be proud of?" His laughter filled the room, and even the police officer seemed to relax. "Ethan has a point," the officer said, turning to me. "Why don't you pay the $3,000 for the food and drinks? He hasn't filed a complaint yet, so you won't face charges." Despite the offer, I declined. Before I could explain, Ethan's face turned red with anger. "You're rejecting my kindness. Is this how you raised your daughter?" he shouted. Trying to calm the situation, I hesitated, but Ethan persisted, warning that my daughter would be arrested if I didn't pay. The officer looked puzzled as I struggled to respond. "I can't agree to this," I finally managed to say. Ethan laughed again, apologizing for his outburst and suggesting I might not have $3,000 on me. "As we get older, we tend to forget things," he added, somewhat mockingly, mentioning that his shop accepted credit cards. "If you trust your credit card to me, I can handle the payment and return it later. Is that okay?" Ethan proposed, motioning for me to get my wallet. I hesitated, feeling uneasy about giving my credit card to someone else. I suggested going together to handle the payment, but Ethan became agitated, raising his fist and shouting, "Don't you trust me? I'm in the credit business. Watch what you say, or you'll regret it." Startled by his sudden hostility, I asked why I couldn't accompany him. He yelled again, claiming disrespect and threatening to use his connections to make me pay. He even mentioned calling the police to handle it legally. Shocked by his threats, I looked to the police officer for help, but he seemed reluctant to intervene, suggesting that if I paid, everything would be resolved. Confused and concerned, I asked the officer if he heard Ethan's threats, but he avoided the question, urging me to comply. I couldn't believe what I was hearing from both Ethan and the officer, feeling completely dumbfounded by the situation. I watched as the steakhouse owner renewed his threats, his harsh words leaving anyone feeling hopeless. Most would give in and pay, but I couldn't allow it. Weren't police officers supposed to protect citizens? Why was this officer siding with the wrong side? Despite my desperate pleas, the officer remained silent, avoiding eye contact. The steakhouse owner continued, demanding payment and warning not to underestimate him because of his age. It wasn't that I underestimated him, it was just unbelievable. I stubbornly refused, but they wouldn't let me explain. Just then, a taxi pulled up and my husband stepped out, confused by the scene. After a brief explanation from the officer, Daniel looked at me in surprise. Seeing my confusion, he seemed to grasp the situation and smiled mischievously. I appreciated his playful side. "Sorry for the trouble," he said to the officer, who seemed taken aback by Daniel's sudden inquiry about his department. The officer hesitated, then revealed a fake badge, causing Daniel to laugh. "Just kidding," he said, lightening the tension. The police officer nervously tried to smile as my husband inquired about his department and rank. "Do you really need that info now?" the officer asked. "Just curious," my husband replied, taking out his phone. "Well, I'm a constable on duty at the police box," the officer answered. "I've never seen you before. Are you new to the area?" my husband asked, thanking him for his service. "Yes, I'm still new," the officer replied. "Would you mind if I contacted your station? Is it okay to use the name on your badge?" my husband inquired. Before he could proceed, the officer redirected the conversation back to Ethan's issue, pressing my husband for an answer. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed taken aback by my husband's assertiveness, his earlier fierceness fading. "You're the husband, right? You need to take responsibility," Ethan interjected. My husband shrugged off the accusation, saying he didn't have a job that paid that much. Unfazed, Ethan insisted he couldn't dodge his bills. Ignoring him, my husband casually asked for the gun's serial number. "What? Why?" the officer exclaimed, hesitating. "Knowing the number won't cause any harm." "Or did you forget?" my husband retorted. "This is a widely accepted verification method," my husband Daniel said with a serious expression. The police officer tilted his head, asking, "Really?" Observing my husband's response and the confusion of the two, my suspicion turned into conviction. Without a doubt, they were in cahoots. "By the way, would you mind hearing my opinion on this dine and dash incident?" my husband asked, giving them a stern look. They seemed puzzled by his sudden request. "In conclusion, you're a fake cop trying to scam us with that old man over there, aren't you?" my husband accused. The two were taken aback by his words. "Do you have any evidence?" they demanded. "Show me the evidence that I'm lying," my husband instructed me. I hurried to the back and brought our precious child in front of them, hoping to prevent any harm to her. My husband stepped between us, stating, "My daughter is only 1 year old. She can't even walk, let alone dine and dash." The two were shocked, their mouths gaping open. "No, that's a lie. Is that child really Area Taylor?" Ethan, the steakhouse owner, asked. "Of course," I replied confidently. "After all, I'm only 30 years old. If this child wasn't my first, at what age would I have had my first child?" Ethan appeared unsettled and took a step back, glancing at the police officer, who nodded in response to his gaze. "Oh, it seems the dine and dasher was someone else." "My apologies," Ethan admitted, and both he and the police officer attempted to flee. But Daniel intervened, encircling them to prevent their escape. I retreated to the entrance and watched through a gap in the door. "Could you perhaps let me through?" the officer requested. "No, we won't let you escape. You might be scammers, and we won't allow it," Daniel replied firmly. The officer threatened to arrest him for obstructing an investigation, but Daniel skillfully evaded his attempts to shove him aside. My apologies for not introducing myself earlier. I'm Daniel Taylor, Chief Inspector of the New York Investigation Division, Daniel declared, pulling out his genuine police badge. What a liar. I'm the real deal, the officer protested. Whether you're real or not doesn't matter. You've committed fraud, which is a disgrace for a police officer, Daniel asserted. Do you understand what the investigation division does? He questioned. Well, what are you talking about? The officer stammered. Daniel explained that the division investigates intelligent crimes such as fraud, embezzlement, and counterfeit money, among others. In other words, it deals with criminals like you, Daniel concluded, swiftly handcuffing them both. Unable to resist his professional demeanor, the two were quickly apprehended by Daniel. Daniel immediately took out his phone and made a call. I've apprehended fraudsters on the spot. This is outside my jurisdiction. Please send officers from the designated area over here immediately, he instructed. The scammers' faces paled upon hearing Daniel's words. Please forgive us. We were just desperate for money. It's our first offense. Please let us go, they pleaded. Just then, my in-laws arrived with the police. Are you okay? Sorry we're late. This guy couldn't explain things properly, my father-in-law apologized. Whatever. Wait, you're here too? My mother-in-law exclaimed, pulling me and our daughter into a hug. Finally, I could relax and breathe a sigh of relief. The two scammers were loaded into a police car. Initially, I thought the old man was the only fraudster. When I asked my in-laws if a man named Ethan lived in the neighborhood, they didn't recognize the name. Since they've lived here for a long time and know everyone around, it meant Ethan didn't exist here. More importantly, my daughter is only 1 year old and couldn't possibly have dined and dashed. Though I hadn't directly asked my in-laws to call the police, they had understood my situation and acted accordingly. Feeling tense, I knew I had to keep the man there until help arrived. My priority was protecting my daughter. Something felt off about the police officer who showed up. After talking to him for a while, I couldn't shake my distrust. Though I had no proof at first, Daniel's questioning confirmed my suspicions. I shuddered to think what could have happened if Daniel hadn't been there. Thankfully, the situation was resolved safely, thanks to Daniel and the area's officer in charge. The fraudster's case was closed after investigation, with numerous charges lined up against them. Daniel shared the story with me, his expression a mix of sadness and anger. It turned out the fraudsters weren't part of an organization, and their faces became widely known through the news. Thanks to Daniel and my in-laws' support, I stayed at their home for another day. The news of Daniel's heroism spread, and neighbors brought over fancy food, turning our gathering into a joyful party. Our daughter seemed to enjoy herself, not crying at all that night. In that moment, I savored my happiness, gazing at my daughter's peaceful face.